I'm going to just start, well, the title of my talk, The Maps and Data Behind the Signing of the International Arctic Fisheries Agreement, but after this morning's talks, I wanted to hit on I want to emphasize how this talk really hits on a couple of the conference themes, like the why and how. And most of the talks we've seen so far have been pretty technical, not all of them. This is way more about the why we do what we do. There's a little bit of how in there, in that we're going to talk about how maps fueled the process, but not how the maps were generated or how the data were processed. What is the agreement I'm talking about? This is a milestone agreement, by the way. I'm surprised there hasn't been a little bit more press about it. There has been internationally. But the agreement is a binding agreement that prevents the start of commercial fisheries in the international waters of the Central Arctic Ocean for at least the next 16 years while scientists assess the impacts of climate change in the region. This has been signed by 9 countries and the EU, and it was signed in October of this year. Like I said, it's a milestone agreement in that it's unprecedented and inclusive. And it's unprecedented in that we've never had a precautionary agreement on this scale where we stopped fishing before it even started. The history of humans and fisheries is we go in when we find a stock to exploit, we exploit it, then we go into crisis mode and try to recover that stock and manage it accordingly. So it's really an unprecedented thing for us to be, and novel to step in and stop fishing before it starts. It's also unprecedented in how inclusive it is, and as I mentioned, there are 9 countries that signed this, including the EU, and it included indigenous peoples from the north in the drafting of the agreement and moving forward with the agreement. So what is the Central Arctic Ocean? Well, it's this area right here. It's roughly the size of the Mediterranean Sea. It's 2.8 million kilometers. And it's the areas outside of the EEZs of the 5 Arctic coastal states. So these are international waters and not subject to regulation without such an agreement. Coming right to the point of what I'm really talking about is I'm going to talk about how maps informed this process, how they were part of this process of developing this agreement and the final signing of it. The maps informed and engaged scientists and citizens from around the world. The maps informed and engaged policymakers from the Arctic states and all the fishing nations that are interested in fishing, would potentially fish in the Arctic. This includes the Arctic states of Canada, Greenland, Norway, Russia, and the USA, and then in addition, China, Japan, South Korea, Iceland, and the EU, all of which have large fishing fleets. It also informed and engaged Arctic communities, and like I said, they were Inuit from Canada, Greenland, and the US were engaged in this process. So what are we talking about when we're talking? Why do we need an agreement? So what you see here is this is the summer minimum extent, and this is what it's been historically. This is the satellite record of 1979 to 2000, but basically for at least 100,000 years or more, the Central Arctic Ocean has been covered with ice all year round. In the recent decades, it has diminished significantly in terms of extent and in other parameters as well, with there being a 40% of the Central Arctic Ocean open in 2007 and also in 2012. And this can be shown graphically as well. You could look at individual years, but if you use decades, it smooths the data out a little bit, makes it a little more digestible. But you can see, again, basically fully covered historically, and then in recent decades it's increased to where, on average, we have 22% of the Central Arctic Ocean open water or ice-free in the summer, with 40% on the high end of that. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because, from a fisheries standpoint, because when you look at the basin of the Central Arctic Ocean, which everyone has often referred to as just, what's up there? There's nothing up there. Well, it's been covered with ice, so we don't really know what's up there. But these are the fishable depths of the Central Arctic Ocean. These are depths less than 2,000 meters. And so these are the typical depths that are fished globally. So there is fishing habitat up there. These are also the types of areas that would support a lot of biodiversity or large numbers of fish. So notice here this is in Inuktitut, and I just included this map in Inuktitut, which is the the language, the kind of the universal language of the Canadian Inuit, and it just shows you how in making these maps, we were reaching out to different nationalities and different peoples in that inclusive way. So those maps and that decline in sea ice led to more than 2,000 scientists from 67 countries signing a letter in support of an international Arctic fisheries agreement in the Central Arctic Ocean. And this is a poster that we produced back in 2012 when we released this. When I say we, by the way, just I now work for Ocean Conservancy, so I'm talking about my colleagues at Ocean Conservancy in the Arctic program, but I also used to work at Pew, so there are Arctic people in the Arctic team there that were very involved in this, and there were scientists and policymakers or policy experts that were involved in this whole process with us as well. So I show this map. It's clearly not one of mine. This just shows, from the standpoint of the EU, there is no problem. I know the Central Arctic isn't drawn on here, but if we go back, well, we won't do that now. It's just in the interest of time. But they didn't see a problem. Plus, they were using maps that were not current when they were discussing the loss of sea ice up there, and there didn't seem to be any urgency from the EU side or the Atlantic and Barents side. Well, what that meant is that we need to continue to create maps and data, package data in a way that people could really understand that there was a problem. So this is just an example showing, again, sea ice extent for 2012 using MODIS composite. Some people digest that kind of information more easily. This is showing for 2016, so every year we would update. And this is interesting because we're not just talking about extent here. You can see how porous the ice is, which also means it's more susceptible to melting. We focused on sea ice thickness, in which, comparing 1980 to 89 to 2010 to 2017, you can see significant decline in thickness, also meaning that it's melting and was more susceptible to melting. Again, you can look at that graphically as well as cartographically. Sea ice volume, same exact story, a threefold decrease. This is by year. This is not summarized for the Central Arctic Ocean specifically, but the Arctic as a whole. This is showing the heat blob or the heat content of Beaufort. Keep hitting the forward button. The Beaufort-Chukchi region. This is a recent paper using data from a recent paper by Timmermans et al. And it just shows how much in the halocline, which is 50 to 150 meter depth, this has warmed and continues to warm in that region. Also, if it's mixed into the surface waters, could promote or make for more melting. So again, graphically versus cartographically, a greater than twofold increase. So maps inform this process. Scientists from around the world were engaged. Policymakers from Arctic states and fishing nations were engaged. And Arctic communities were engaged, and it resulted in this, which was just signed. And this really is a milestone achievement. And it really fits with one of the things Jack said this morning about geoscience being a foundation for decision-making that make our future better. And by shutting down the fisheries there before we start and getting baseline information, we are working toward the future. So that also plays into Dawn's optimism, which I really enjoyed personally, because it's a little hard to be optimistic at times. So just to emphasize, these maps were not on a single platform. We had wall maps, science papers in various languages, information packets, science briefs, blogs, even video content using ArcScene. And I'm going to just end on that map as it shows, or these pictures, as it shows maps being used as a common language and tool for communication among scientists, hunters, policymakers. And this is the actual signing of the agreement. You can see the map back there. These are a couple of Inuit hunters, and this is Inuit hunters and scientists in Greenland looking at maps of the Arctic. And that's all I have.